contribute to the Chief Minister's Disaster Relief Fund. We shall overcome.
Hello and welcome to this 200th episode of Latitude. And on this special occasion, we have a special guest with us, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who's been formerly India's Foreign Secretary and was recently the Chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, is also on the governing body of the Center for Policy Research, a life trustee of the India International Center, is an author, columnist, and a person with very clear but very strong views on the number of foreign policy challenges that India will continue to face and currently is facing in the changing and dynamic global order. Welcome to the show, sir. We are going to look at, in this episode, a number of foreign policy challenges that are there at this point in India, and India has to make some tough choices, particularly on the lines of what you wrote recently in one of the May papers, to say that we need to determine, as far as India is concerned, that what kind of place it wants to occupy in the global order, and where do we begin focusing on. And you had then gone on to say that your focus areas should be neighborhood first, Act East, and the Indian Ocean, and therefore, if this be the template under which we are looking at world affairs, let me ask you the first question on neighborhood first. How much do you think the policies of Prime Minister Narendra Modi have been different from his predecessor, Dr. Manmohan Singh, both of whom were conscious of the fact that the neighborhood must get attention, but there are a lot of distractions in the neighborhood also?
Quite right. So, as you yourself said, that both Dr. Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Narendra Modi have in fact committed themselves to giving the highest priority to India's neighborhood. And I must also acknowledge the fact that right from the beginning of his term as Prime Minister, Mr. Modi made the first moves, in fact, in our neighborhood, inviting all the leaders of the South Asian countries, visiting the neighboring countries. So I cannot fault him in terms of actually, in some sense, even delivering on the priority attached to the neighborhood. But one or two elements one must focus on. One is that any relationship involves both India as well as its partner. So you do not always have control over what the partner is doing or what is happening in the partner country. And I think that element we need to acknowledge, whether it is with respect to Pakistan, Nepal, or what may have happened in the Maldives at the just a few days ago. So one is that aspect, but it has been always my contention that political changes will always happen. You cannot freeze political changes. What you need to be able to do is that India should, with its neighbors, build up a very broad-ranging relationship. It should build up a relationship of great economic interdependency, that even if there are swings on the political side, there is a certain stability to the relationship.
But this is what brings me to my second question, sir, and this is that, while we claim to be working hard in a number of areas on foreign policy, and I'm also conscious of the fact that our foreign service could do with more hands to help out.
Absolutely.
It's short-staffed. But more importantly, the issue is that about a year ago, it looked that, a lot of ground in our neighborhood, which we traditionally regarded as our area of influence, had been gradually going away from our area of impact or influence, and the Chinese footprint was growing larger. Yeah. Whether it was Sri Lanka, it's been for decades in Pakistan, Maldives for the last couple of years was almost a lost story till the hand of fate has brought Maldives back into the play.
But we can't depend on that.
Yes. So therefore, what would be your critical appraisal in the case of Nepal, Maldives in particular, and lesser so in the case of some of the other countries? What do we need to do to counter China's deep pockets agenda?
So, in the article that you mentioned, I have also pointed out that we have overwhelming power in a sense as far as our neighborhood is concerned. So, China actually cannot match the advantages that we have of geography. I think great advantage that we have in terms of the cultural affinities which bind us to these countries. I mean, take for example Nepal, or even the place that India could occupy as a kind of an engine of growth for the entire region. You know, these are the assets which you have to leverage. Unfortunately, I think this is something which I would not blame only this government, but this has been, I think, a structural problem for quite some time. One, as you said, we simply don't have enough people, you know, looking after the neighborhood. Second, the relationship has to be nurtured not only at the bureaucratic level but also at the political level. There should be continuous engagement at a high level politically with these countries. And the third is, even though we talk about connectivity, but actually if you see South Asia, it is still perhaps one of the least connected regions compared to other regions.
Right. So, you know, connectivity brings me to another area which you have talked about, sir, which is technology. That the advent of technology would eventually make people being able to connect between here and the US, here and Europe, here and China, Japan, elsewhere, much more effectively, which again spins out another question, the irrelevance of borders if you're well connected. Now, how does that bear up against our ongoing border disputes with China and Pakistan?
Well, I would not go as far as to say that borders have become irrelevant, but I think it is certainly very important that our mindset in terms of how we look at these borders, that mindset needs to be changed. That is why I say you should not be looking at borders as walls behind which you have to hide, but rather as these are the points through which you connect with your neighbors. You know, so you have to make borders, in fact, connectors.
Okay.
So this is something which, you know, Dr. Manmohan Singh, if you remember,
I know. He talked about the irrelevance of borders.
Well, not so much irrelevance. He said, I do not have the mandate to change India's borders, but I have the mandate to make the borders such that there can be a free flow of goods, of services, of ideas, sharing of cultures across these borders. I think that is what we should aim at.
Right. So a lot of important areas have been covered, and we need to go in quickly for a break, sir. But we'll come back to look at the big picture globally and the big challenges that India is up against with the superpowers and the powers in the making as to how India positions itself. But that after a break. Welcome back. We continue to have the distinguished Mr. Shyam Saran with us, former Foreign Secretary of India, now head of many initiatives in India, looking at a range of foreign policy efforts and initiatives that India should look at. He's also been formerly the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, is an author and a regular columnist. Mr. Shyam Saran, sir, you were making some very interesting points about, you know, how India should deal with its border issues. But before I go on to the big picture, the one constant challenge for India's policymakers and your diplomatic community has been Pakistan. And even most recently, there was this effort by Pakistan through the back door to try and come back into reckoning with India by their foreign minister to meet the Indian foreign minister and then probably add a spin to it and announce that we've started engaging again, so the past be the past and let's look at a fresh chapter. But there are constant irritants with Pakistan. And one of them, I have once shared a platform with you in which you were very strongly against Pakistan and the use of terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy. What are your views now?
Well, that view has not changed. I mean, I think it is counterproductive for Pakistan to try and still use cross-border terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy, when this has only succeeded in isolating Pakistan internationally and even within the region itself. But that is a choice for Pakistan to make. But having said that, it has also been my view that, neighbors being neighbors, you need to have engagement with neighbors. That is to say, I will not talk to you, I will not engage with you. This to me seems an admission that we don't have other levers to influence, Pakistan as far as India-Pakistan relations are concerned. So yes, terrorism must be at the top of the agenda in our engagement, but engagement has to be there, because it is only through engagement, only through dialogue, that you can start dealing with the many issues that stand between
I'll just extend this question further, because we need to cover a lot more ground. But on this one, if you engage with Pakistan, you see, then it comes back to the same ongoing debate that put Kashmir on top of the agenda and don't put terrorism. Look, and there are many in Pakistan who continue to argue.
Kashmir has always been on the bilateral agenda. I mean, merely by saying Kashmir is not on the agenda doesn't mean that...
No, they say put it on top of the agenda and we'll address all other issues.
We had already agreed, when we had the comprehensive dialogue, we had already agreed that there would be several issues on the agenda, including the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. No question of, this has primacy or something else has primacy. So we cannot have an engagement where we shy away from discussing Kashmir. After all, I would say that we should have Kashmir on the agenda, because you are occupying 1/3 of that territory which belongs to us. So we have an issue too with respect to Kashmir.
And we have levers against them which we have been a bit reluctant
We have been reluctant to use those levers. I think I have also spoken about that earlier.
So I'll move on to something else now, because otherwise India-Pakistan can take up a lot of time. China.
Yes.
China is one which has a growing footprint all over the world, more so in Asia. But you've also argued in one of your writings to say that China is going to have unhampered access to power and supremacy all over the world is a bit of an overstatement.
Oh, yes,
and so therefore, how do you deal with China with the territorial issue? Because you believe territorial dispute or no dispute, let's move on other issues with China. And then how do you deal with China's growing influence all over in India's periphery? So these are issues.
Let me start by making the point that the one great advantage which India has, which no other country has, is that it is perhaps the only country, given its population, given its area, given its economic potential, given its scientific and technological capabilities, this is the only country which could, in fact, match China and perhaps even overtake it. But that means you have to take certain decisions yourself in terms of building up your capabilities. So if you wish to aspire to a global as a role as a global power, then those domestic decisions become imperative. However, at this particular point of time, we are facing a asymmetry of power between the two sides. How do you deal with that asymmetry of power? Now, the one way of dealing with that asymmetry of power, for example, with respect to the border, is that you should at least have the capability of making it very highly risky for the other side to create provocations on the border. That is one. At least that much capability you need to have. Second is, you need to have relationships with those countries which share our concern about China, which is unilaterally trying to assert its power. And I think we have been, of course, moving in that direction. I am not so sure that the kind of political will which is required in order to really build up, marshal our resources, build up our capabilities, that is perhaps not yet in focus.
Okay, so here brings me to another linked area, which is the growing American engagement with India. We recently had the 2+2 meeting, but prior to that also, America, you've been party to the Indo-US nuclear deal. You have pushed it through. Subsequently also, there has been a desire on the part of America to look at India more favorably, particularly post the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan. But now, with America making it also known that you're either with us or you're not really going to get all the benefits that by being with us you can get, and which puts India into having to take a tough decision that if you're with the Americans, you're obviously getting China's backup more, and thereby eventually, and that's going to be my next question, how does it impact on Indo-Russian relations? But first, India-China, Indian Ocean, and America's desire to India and America to look at Indian Ocean region as another area where joint engagement can
Well, we already have very close relationship with the United States as far as the Indian Ocean region is concerned, what we are now calling Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
So that's already in place, and I think you will see a further consolidation of this cooperation between the two countries as we go along, because it is in their common interest. I think the difference is that if you say it might provoke China, my experience is exactly the opposite. I think the more options India has, the better relationship that it has with other major powers, the United States of America, with Japan, with Europe. In fact, it gives you more options dealing with China. So I do not buy the argument that you should not go in terms of a closer relationship with the United States because somehow or the other it will provoke China. Actually, the opposite has been the case. But we are not seeking an alliance with the United States. That is, we will not become a subordinate ally of the United States. Where our interests are convergent, we will work together. But there are also areas where we do not have convergent interests.
And that's what brings me to your relationship with Russia.
Okay.
And the American pressure that, for instance, you cannot buy
to
arms and
S-400,
equipment from Russia. The S-400 is one case in point. And I think India is putting its foot down to say that, there are certain areas we will not compromise on. So how does this tricky angle with dealing with Washington and Moscow come in, when Moscow has said that if you're not fully with us, then we go more with the Chinese and Pakistanis?
Well, two things. One is, as far as the relationship between Russia and China is concerned, I have had the view that even though for reasons that are obvious, Russia has had to move closer to China because of the pressure it is facing from the US and from Europe. If you look at Russia's long-term interests, it is Eastern Europe, it is Central Asia. Which is the country which is expanding most in these two areas of special interest to Russia? It is in fact China. So I think there is, long term if we are looking at, I do not see such a great alignment of interests between Russia and China, and I think we should keep that in mind as we maintain and develop our relations with Russia, because in the long term this may become very important. Second is with regard to balancing our relationship with Russia and the United States. You are absolutely right. We have to do a balancing. I think in this particular case, if our judgment is that the S-400 is critical to the defense of India, and there are no good alternatives available, I see no reason why we should not take that decision. And I think even though it would be quite normal for United States to try and put pressure on you, I have also been through many junctures in our relationship in the past where when we have frankly said, sorry, as far as this issue is concerned, we have to just agree that perhaps at this point of time our interests are somewhat divergent. I think we should be frank enough to make that position clear if that becomes necessary.
And this is my last question, short answer. What you have said should be neighborhood first, look east, Indian Ocean. What about looking west, immediate west, with the Middle East out there, where we have huge dependence on energy there? Is that going to be the way in the future also? Is there an alternate?
So when I talk about the Indian Ocean, to me this includes the western reaches of the Indian Ocean as much as it does the eastern reaches of the Indian Ocean. So you are absolutely right, not only for the energy aspect, but there are 6 million Indians who are living and working in that region.
Absolutely.
There is also, many people forget that there is also a sectarian dimension. There is a huge clash taking place between Shia and Sunni in this region. It is getting exacerbated. Don't forget that in India, we have the second largest Shia population after Iran.
Yes.
So there could be a backwash effect if there is a sharpening of those tensions in the region. So for all these reasons, actually this particular area is of very great importance to India, and I'm glad to see that this government has actually paid more attention, perhaps relatively speaking, to this region than perhaps has been the case in the past.
Well, very important points all covered by you, sir. I think it's a short lesson on Indian foreign policy. And thank you very much for being with us on the show. Quite clearly, there are challenges, but as experts like Mr. Shyam Saran are looking at it and providing inputs, those who wish to listen, I'm sure, must be listening. And I think it's important for India to look at its own role in a much more positive and aggressive manner in what it can do with its own positioning in the Indian Ocean region and how it must handle its neighborhood. Thank you for being with us on the show, sir. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.